This episode is brought to you by Polestar. Time is luxury, which is why Polestar spent so much time designing the Polestar 3, their luxury electric performance SUV. It's designed to go further with up to 315 miles of range and immerse you in a unique listening experience powered by 25 speakers. Your favorite daily news podcast has never sounded better. All to make the time you spend behind the wheel of Polestar 3 the best time of your day. Book your test drive at polestar.com.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Satisfy your iced coffee craving without leaving home with custom blends. From double espressos to cold brew style. Meant to be iced, meant to be simple, and consistently delicious with a touch of a button. Visit Nespresso.com to learn more.
To the Fantasy Footballers DFS and Betting Podcast with your hosts, Kyle Borganoni and Matthew Betts.
Welcome in. It's Friday, August 9th here on the Fantasy Footballers DFS and Betting Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Borganoni, and I'm joined by special guest, Matt Savoca.
Oh, Matt Savoca. If you want to get the spelling or pronunciation right, but that's all right. Also, I've heard much worse in my days. Sokovia, which I think is that the Marvel place. Anyway, what's up, man? I'm not Matt Betts, but at least I have the right first name. So happy to be here. Happy to meet you on a podcast. I know we've talked, off the airwaves, but it's great to be here, and I'm very excited.
Yeah, speaking of Marvel, we have a Matt variant with us today, and Matt is one of our newest writers for the Fantasy Footballers. He's done lots of work in lots of different places. He'll even get to talk about, a little project that he's been working on, a little website over the last, year plus. And so, I want to get Matt on here. One, because Betts still doesn't want to show up to work. I believe he even tweeted out today that he doesn't know what day it is, and he's at that point of paternity leave. So even if he was here, I don't know if he would be helpful to the people, especially like at this point in the season. I mean, no big deal, right? It's just August. We're just gearing up. I mean, we're supposed to be excited for football, right, Matt?
Right. And, maybe in that fugue state, he knows where Brandon Ayuk is playing. And you know what? At this point, we're obviously recording slightly in the past. By the time you're listening, we have some clarity with that. But as of now, still nothing. Still just lots of conversations with that, but I mean, it's the best time of year. There's so much hope, right?
Yes.
We do have some injuries we got to talk about. We got to work through already, but that's football. But no one's lost a game. No one's lost a fantasy week yet. It's a great time.
Yes, especially if you've drafted best ball, and we'll get to some of your questions. I mean, your rosters are looking good. You can just basically, as Betts always says, just go ahead and spend the money, right? Just charge it. Prime
victory lap season. Also, can we talk about just the sheer volume of training camp victory laps we're seeing on social media right now? It is a joy, if I could say, on the Twitter sphere or the X sphere, whatever we're calling it these days. No games played, but lots of victory laps taken by the fantasy industry at large. Gotta love it.
Yep. On this episode, we're going to be talking the biggest DFS questions. So we'll be going through some listener questions, talking showdown strategy, because I know that's part of your background. And before we get into those questions, I just want to ask, how did you get into the fantasy space? Where are you from? We even were talking earlier about football and kind of where your allegiances lie and where they've kind of changed. So kind of give people a background of where you've worked, because you've done some work with 444. You did a lot of showdown stuff with TJ Hernandez, who we love, friend of the show. Matt, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I grew up in DC. I was brought into this world right after DC football had its heyday, after all those Super Bowls. And so I grew up with a team that really was floundering for a long time. And I loved football, and I loved, interacting with data around that, but I didn't really formalize that until really after school. And I moved to New York for school. And at that point, I kind of moved away from loving the laundry, if you will, to really enjoying just the players. And of course, got into my first really serious fantasy league. And that's where things kind of took off from there. And, while my professional career took twists and turns right after school, I eventually got into, I don't know if you want to call it data science, data analysis, but it's basically using statistics, math, code to try to solve this game that has so much randomness involved already. And so, I basically broke a spreadsheet and I asked what's next. And that was about 9 years ago. So from there, I, of course, kind of beefed up on statistical training, coding, all that fun stuff. And around COVID, when I was actually, trying to go into like a more traditional data science or data analyst route, I reached out to Stochastic with a couple of ideas that maybe I could help implement and some content stuff. And lo and behold, they were looking for some help in that department anyway, and the match kind of worked out really, really well. And so I ended up working there for several years, working on a ton of stuff, obviously on the content side, doing again still like some data analysis, charting, graphing, all that stuff, but also kind of getting into the content game and realizing I really love that stuff too. And so over the course of that was 2021. And from there, started doing more stuff with TJ Hernandez and 4for4 as well, doing stuff for FanDuel cash games, and then kind of falling into a niche with Showdown. I really love single game slates, the game theory surrounding it. And when they asked me at 4for4 to kind of redo their statistical models, their rostership models, their floor and ceiling models last season, I thought that was a really cool problem to tackle. So worked with TJ behind the scenes, got to do some content in front of the scenes or whatever you want to call it, and then doing every game analysis. So just like digging into single game slates at that level for a year was kind of transformative in my understanding of just the macro of football. And I'm not going to be the one saying I'm the biggest ball knower ever, especially as a big data, statistics, predictive analytics guy. But I kind of feel like we're at this inflection point where so many pieces of technology have entered the game. So many people are kind of, I would use the word worried about the way things are going in DFS. And I actually, and best ball and betting and all that stuff. And I actually think that there is this, for lack of a better word, freedom that you now have in the way that you can think about ranges of outcomes and the way that you can think about approaching these games. And not to say like I'm some big evangelist of any one site or any one place, but I really do think that people may have a little bit of the wrong idea about where DFS is. And I'm really excited about the way peer-to-peer games are going in sports in general. And I just kind of want to share that message. So that's one of the reasons I reached out to the Ballers. I wanted to, get involved with a place that kind of shares that vibe as well. And that's what we were kind of talking about, as we met off stream, about just like kind of like, bringing some good vibes back to the DFS and betting space. And, from there, I also want to just win more. I want to make better predictive metrics. I want to write better code. And I think that with some of the way that some of the industry's earlier heavy hitters have moved on to different problems, that gives us a chance for a new wave of chart makers and statisticians and coders to come in and, try to figure out this game that has so much randomness and is so much fun.
Yeah, I was talking with Caleb, our guest last week, about just how DFS has changed. Like when he won the Millie Maker, it was 2018. I started getting more into DFS like originally like 2015, 2016, and the space has changed a lot. And so
sure,
I think our audience, Betts and I's approach has always been, we want things to be teachable, accessible for people to figure out what is their goals. And I think this is that part of the year you were saying earlier, like it's brimming with hope. And I think with DFS, we've tried to make sure, I talked about my lessons learned last week. This week, you and I are going to focus on some Showdown stuff and then some other questions from our listeners. So I'm excited to get into that. And if you want to get all of our articles, our optimizer, which we talked about last week, our season-long player props, you can get them in the 2024 Ultimate Draft Kit. So go to ultimatedraftkit.com. But man, we're about a month away from Ravens and Chiefs. So I wanted to kind of change gears and focus in on that. We're going to have an entire episode where we talk just about this game, but you and I are going to maybe give more of like a tip, an approach of like how we look at single games. So I'm going to start off talking about this game and then get your kind of high level thoughts. But Ravens and Chiefs right now is the Chiefs at home, favored by 3. It's a 46.5 over under on DK. And if you remember last year, like KC games were not the same. We could not press copy and paste from, and this is just what the Chiefs are. I mean, for the first, since Mahomes became the starter in 2018, their average over under was at 51.3. Last year, 45.9. We had to kind of change our gears. Only 5 of their games hit the over. It was weird. And at home, it was 1-8 to the over. So it was like one of those things last year where you had to change your perspective on the Chiefs. So before we get into some tips, anything we can take with that data moving forward, or is like, okay, it's 2024, who cares?
I do think that the way that Kansas City managed their offensive game flow is something that is up for debate. And I'm not sure how much we can carry over when they have added so much speed on the outside. They clearly recognize the deficiency that you're talking about in their lack of ability to score in large bunches. And they kind of know that they need to be able to beat teams that way. You know, Mahomes or not, you need to be able to score 40 points in certain shootout environments. And, you know, some of the metrics that I look at, which is your ability to turn a drive into a score, which I call true drive success rate, and EPA per play, we saw that Mahomes was at basically career low levels in those metrics. Career low for Mahomes is still top 10 in the NFL. So I do think that his ability to turn drives into scores has not diminished. And those scores just happen to be more in the field goal variety than we're used to. And that's why you see them adding Hollywood Brown, Xavier Worthy, leaning on Pacheco as a bell cow. I know the Ravens defense is consistently vaunted, and betting on unders in week 1 is a winning move in general. But I still think we can think in terms of the full Mahomes range of outcomes when we talk about the Chiefs offense in general. So I don't mind going, thinking about this game in terms of, can it go over that 46.5 point total, and what do winning showdown lineups look like?
Yes.
If that's the case, because really, we can go into the nuances of single game slates as we go down the rest of the show here. But the way that I like to think about showdown is build lineups for the type of game you believe happens. And most likely, you believing in a game that is different than what Vegas implies the game will be like is when you can win big in showdown slates. If the game goes exactly like everyone hoped, a bunch of people are probably going to be chopping up those top prizes at the top because the chalk probably hit. But when the game deviates, that's when things get really interesting. And we know that ceiling, that upside, really for both quarterbacks is there. So I do think that there's this, in the range of outcomes for Jackson versus Mahomes, you have these 55, 60, 65 point games in there, even though we've seen it kind of go under. And again, in week 1, betting unders just blindly can be pretty profitable. So again, that's kind of the way I'm thinking about the range of outcomes for this one going into it.
Yeah, I was going through the thought process of like, I'm giving all these stats of here's what they did last year. At Arrowhead, the average points per game was 39. It just sounds terrible. I'm going to use that information as leverage if the field just thinks it's what it is. If this game was played in 2021 or 2022 in week 1 and you had Jackson Mahomes, I bet the over-under is over 50. I mean, I would bet my life on it. Mm-hmm. And so the pendulum swings in the NFL year to year.
You just said, and you had Jackson Mahomes, which we don't know anything about, specifically Jackson Mahomes being there, so we don't want to involve ourselves. But Lamar Jackson versus Patrick Mahomes, you're 100% right.
Jackson Mahomes would just you pound the under, man. If he's throwing the rock, you definitely don't want that. But it's definitely one of those things where year to year, that is perfect that you called that out. That it's year to year. We look at this is how things are, especially when you look at these defenses. We know that year to year, turnover differential, all those things, they're just not sticky. So yeah, I agree with you. I'm looking at this Ravens offensive line, not to get too much in the matchup. It's just like, it's a different line than we've ever dealt with as well. So in these type of environments, like there's some scripts that I already like. And yes, I do like the over. Last year, I told people, if you just blindly bet the under of every 50-point game, you're going to win at like a 60% clip. It held true last year. I'm not saying that this year, I think lines are going to change a little bit. So give me one kind of takeaway. You kind of hinted at it, but like you got to build the right lineup, or you got to build a narrative and just kind of run with it. And so kind of give people the nitty gritty of what that looks like in a single game.
So yeah, I really think that the biggest single game tip I can give is build the right lineup for the right contest. Because the contest you enter in single game slates, it dictates almost everything. And I know that sounds a little trite because obviously the contest you enter in any DFS slate, in any sport, dictates the lineup you provide. But in a game like DFS that is against your opponent, when there are a smaller pool of rational plays, you really have to think about how irrational, I say in quotation marks, your lineup needs to get depending on the number of players you're playing against. So unlike a main slate, the salary for the primary players of a single game slate pretty much dictates the field's behavior. And what that means is you're only going to find one or two players per salary tier that make any sort of sense, that are essentially sane picks. And yet there's some amount of, dare I say, insane or irrational picks that tend to float to the top of winning lineups in large field tournaments. Also, just the fact that in single game slates that you have, everyone understands what the value plays are, and there's kind of a coalescing of what those value plays are on a points per dollar standpoint. Everyone knows who the chalk plays are, and people can kind of condense all of that information into their head. It does take a certain amount of avoiding hyper rational thinking, hyper pragmatic thinking, in order to get contrarian enough in these larger field contests. And I think it also ties into what you were saying earlier about what do you want DFS to be for you? Because I know a ton of people who are happy to enter 5 to 10 lineups in the largest field contest with the largest winnings, knowing that the DFS sharps are in there max entering, and they're okay losing, close to 100% on a weekly basis with that chance that they can intelligently get to the top. What I want to help those people with is, how irrational can I get? How crazy, how off the board can I get while still being unique enough to win? But then I also want to help people in these smaller field contests like you've talked about in the past, where I only have to deviate one or maybe two plays from what everyone knows is the obvious. And, I'll go into some data here, but you'll be surprised at how often the field leaves off the QB2, as in like the underdog quarterback, as a captain option, or the second highest projected flex as a captain option, because it's just too off the board. We're talking about the fourth highest projected player on lots of slates that are just too off the board and get underutilized at captain positions. And, I'll go into some of the data as we get further on. But ultimately, in these smaller fields, you basically can do cash plus one deviation. In these larger fields, you might have to get as weird as you've possibly gotten in your entire DFS life.
Yeah, and we've gone through, and we'll go through some of the data once we get to looking mostly at this game. I mean, we're not looking at roster percentage projections or anything right now. But in general, the field thinks it's doing things enough. For instance, just like, okay, I'm rostering the favored quarterback, and it's really small edges. And that's kind of my big thing, is like, there are these small edges that still exist because somebody's throwing in a couple bucks in these large fields, and they're not really thinking I'm going to get a return. They're not thinking about this in a way that's, actually like calculated in some ways. But I think at the end of the day, when I look at rostering certain captains, I'm kind of asking the question, like, if this is the optimal captain, how does this affect the rest of his teammates? That's kind of the order that I'm looking at things. And at the end of the day, I think people aren't rostering, favorites even enough. And then once again, the quarterback too, like you mentioned, like if it's a close spread like this, it's just 3 points right now, I think Lamar Jackson's a great play if this game hits the over. I think he's an amazing play considering, the different bonuses that we get to and him rushing. So it's the small edges of roster percentage stuff that matter.
Absolutely. And if I can add to that, it's about finding the ways to be contrarian enough, not asking, am I contrarian in this lineup? Because we'll find ways to do that when we build the way you're talking about. When we use the underdog captain and then we use a correlated play, we've probably deviated enough from the normal, the chalk, that might be enough in certain lineups. But when we start to put contrarianism on a spectrum, on a scale, then we can suddenly free ourselves up to say, okay, well, these are the dials I can turn if I'm doing a small field tournament with this core. And then these are the dials I'll turn the other way if I'm going to a large field tournament while still using that same base, like that same small edge. Okay, I'm going to use the underdog quarterback because they might not be used here. And I'm going to pair them with one receiver. So you can see how suddenly like this becomes a game of almost like a puzzle, a game theory puzzle, rather than I need to devote myself to optimizers and sims, which it can sometimes feel like if you're, listening around the DFS sphere these days.
Yeah, I think for me, my preference for Showdown, and Betts does the Thursday night article that you'll find in the DFS pass. Like, I try not to go too deep into an optimizer with Showdowns because I'm really taking a narrative, I'm selecting a captain, and I'm going from there and figuring out like, okay, well, like in these certain pricing tiers, everyone's kind of hovering to this player. Like, it's like, oh, here's this running back who's 2,400. I'm just going to go after that. Or here's the punt play that I think is going to get a bunch of snaps. Here's the defense that everyone just assumes this is the game flow. And you can almost just in your head write those down on a sheet of paper. And so I think for me, I try to simplify the process, knowing that the field is going to make mistakes. Like here, over the last 2 years, the average roster percentage of the top 1% lineups, the captain was just at 10 to 15%. Like it's not this crazy far out there thing. It's just identifying. We don't have to get that different, as long as we're being mindful of the rest of our lineup. So any last just stats you want to give or tips before we move into the mailbag?
Lean into ambiguity when you know that opportunity is there as well, like ambiguous backfields. If we're in a situation where we've got two backfield mates who are going to get touches, it's a great opportunity to use the one who's supposed to get less opportunities and build out a lineup from there. That's just one hypothetical example. Or a team like the Texans with 3 obvious wide receiver 1 options based on salary. It might actually make sense to go up in salary because no one sees a median projection difference between 2 or 3 players. So going up in salary gets you to a higher rarity, and suddenly that changes the shape of your roster. One thing I do want to mention is that, like, in general, people play it safe with their flex lineups, where we see like QB2 being way overvalued, like a 50 to 60% total rostership, while these ambiguous flex players get way undervalued. And I want to separate that from players captaining those ambiguous players, because that's usually a good thing, like a QB2 or a flex 1,
yes,
if you will. But at the flex positions, the non-captain positions, leaning in to those players who are being less utilized, whether that's because of salary and no projection difference, or a slight projection difference, but a major salary difference as well. That can really, really help you just create on paper, no optimizers, no computers, different lineups than the field.
Yeah. So we'll have more for you guys. I mean, we're going to dissect that game every single way. And if anything, all of us are going to overthink that game for the next month as we lead up to that Thursday. But it should be good. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll jump into the mailbag.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Satisfy your iced coffee craving without leaving home with custom blends. From double espressos to cold brew style. Meant to be iced, meant to be simple, and consistently delicious with a touch of a button. Visit Nespresso.com to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by our good friends at NFL Sunday Ticket on YouTube TV. I'm sure by now you've all gotten back into your Sunday routines, but they could be even better. With NFL Sunday Ticket and YouTube TV, you get the most live NFL games all in one place, every game, every Sunday. And you can even watch up to 4 different games at once with multi-view, one of my favorite inventions of this decade. It's exactly what you need to catch all the action. Make your Sundays more magical. And also, YouTube TV is great. I got it this year. It's awesome. Sign up now at youtube.com/BS Device and content restrictions apply. Local and national games on YouTube TV. NFL Sunday Ticket for out-of-market games excludes digital-only games.
All right, usually on Fantasy Footballers, we have a live mailbag drop, but I wanted to do something special. I'm not going to put you to the test, Matt. I know most people do it in their cars or in the shower. They say, they give their mailbag, and I've done some terrible ones. But I wanted to give you a little taste because we have a live show coming up in Los Angeles. And so I went through the Dropbox and I made sure to find a live mailbag drop. This one's from Minnesota years ago. So let's get into it.
Mailbag.
I mean, what
Fantastic.
a great group of people. Minnesotans are nice people in general, right? Like that's what they're known for. It's just this Midwestern charm.
I have experienced nothing but that in Minnesota. I haven't been there a ton, but when I have, it has been just the loveliest time and the loveliest people.
Yeah, my neighbors right now, next door neighbors, so I'm here in Atlanta, they're from Minnesota. They are huge Vikings fans. He's opening up a brewery, little shout out to his brewery, but like it's called Skull Brewing, a brewery. So like named after, Viking stuff. So I'm around Vikings fans, Commanders fan across the street, Steelers fan right 2 houses down from that. I'm and there's some Falcons fans, of course. But yeah, so you said earlier you're more of like I like players. I'm not, if Washington wins, they win, but you're not like, okay, are you excited for Jaden Daniels at least?
Oh, absolutely. And I won't lie, when the team does well, like I still feel good about it, but yeah, I mean, I do definitely root for players more than teams, and
Yes.
when you inject the business side of football, it always gets complicated, to be honest. And that's honestly one of my favorite reasons to go all in on something like DFS and fantasy football, is because I can just purely enjoy the players and their excellence on the field. But yeah, of course, I was a fan just like anyone else before I found fantasy football, and couldn't be more stoked. I also know to temper expectations even after a year. I mean, RG3 I got a lot of feelings there, but he was spectacular for fantasy and for real life football that first year. Just magic. And then obviously the injury, and I got feelings about what happened from there, but we know that times have changed. Ownership has changed. The name has changed. The name may change again. Things look good. And I like the offense a lot.
Fun fact. So RG3 is one of Mike's favorite players of all time for fantasy. And you can't tell based on the studio, the way that it looks, but there is a massive fat head of RG3 still sitting there. In the studio, because he is always going to have a special place. For me, when it comes to like teams and stuff, I think a lot of times people are confused because I'll wear King Griffey Jr. stuff all the time, Mariners hat, Angels hat. That's like Angels in the outfield, but I'm a Braves fan. But baseball is one of those sports right now where I can purely enjoy it for the sport and for players. I just love watching it, and I don't have the same, I'm not putting in the same time that I do for football. So I kind of miss that. Like I miss that about football, that I can't just watch it sometimes and detach. And you're probably a fan out there for your team, and you're just like, what are you talking about? My team is everything. They can never do wrong. My team does lots of things wrong. I can tell you that.
Yeah. You know what though? Like, let everyone have their fandoms is a little bit how I feel. I should say, don't come after people on social media, because that seems to be the sport, half the sport these days. But I do think that I think people get really rah-rah, and I'm not sure why. And so a part of the reason I feel like I pivoted into fantasy is because I wasn't into that. And maybe it's just self-selecting. Like, people want to be that into fandom. And
yes,
that's great too. How about you win your league and win some bets along the way, win some DFS contests? That's what we'll help you do here.
Yeah, and I think all of them, every part of the spectrum of that is great for fandom. The first question is from our Discord, which, reminder, you have access if you have the DFS pass, and we're basically all the questions, all the conversations. People already putting out cash lineups too early, but they're doing it for week one. But this first one's from Solozilla. He said, last week you guys talked about how the optimizer was created to generate lineups that have features of past winning lineups. That's a lot of the data that Caleb's kind of mined. How can you leverage that knowledge to be contrarian? Would you do a contrarian play in a large field GPP versus a small field? And I think there's a lot of nuance to talking about this and what an optimizer is meant to do and mining it out. But yes, I think it is built more towards large field stuff, the way that Caleb's done it, like looking at Millie Maker data. But for me, I think at the end of the day, I'm trying to find a core that I'm working with. And in these large field, it really comes down to mixing and matching. Like you're not going to, golden bullet this thing and just say, I figured out the one lineup. To me, it's a core of players that I'm finding between high roster percentage and mixing in a couple of low. But I think it gears itself more towards large field stuff.
I think so, but I also think that optimizers, when utilized the right way, can be immensely helpful for cash games as well. You know what? With so much automation and the simulation tools in the current version of DFS, simply being sane but different in your process can be a humongous boon. And so when you're looking at game similarities to find plays like this tool is, you have to remember that similar does not mean the same. So there are times where game similarities will naturally lead us towards plays that everyone's on anyway. That's the chalk, and that's okay. But areas where historical data differs is honestly where we can take our edges. Those are our inflection points where you can decide, okay, do I want to go with the lesser owned player and be more contrarian, or do I want to lean into the chalk? This is good chalk, and make sure that I have this person in my lineup. And think about this when you're playing like 3 to 5 lineups. That lean in might mean that you're just locking that player in for all 5 or 4 out of the 5. And so, Solazilla, I also recognize your name from the Discord streets somewhere out there. Remember, it's not you're being contrarian, it's how contrarian do I need to be for this tournament? So that will determine what you do at those inflection points. So when historical data and the projections that we have, they differ, you can ask yourself, helpful questions. Are the projections right? Are they picking up on things that historical data cannot fully pick up on? Or are the projections fragile, like we're talking about with the ambiguous backfield example? While the volume looks good on paper, maybe history is actually telling us that opportunity and production isn't necessarily guaranteed. So that's where you can lean into that uncertainty and, again, be more contrarian along that spectrum.
Especially with wide receivers. I mean, you look at our projections, we're not going to tell you a player is going to be projected for 28 points. Like, it's just not going to happen. But with a 100-yard bonus, full PPR and DK, you can mess around with those if you want. Like, you can actually go in, look at the projections, put in a ceiling projection, and say to yourself, like, okay, like, here's this wide receiver. I know they have this in their bag. DJ Moore, for instance. Like, okay, he's projected for 15 points. I know it's in his bag, like against Washington last year, where he's like, I'm going to go for 46. Like, it's possible to do that. And so when you're looking at some of these lineups, you're looking at players like, let's say DJ Moore that week, we're like, I don't know which wide receiver it's going to be. Is it Keenan Allen? He seems like the safe cash play this week. DJ Moore, we like him. Roma Dunze. Roma Dunze is like 4K for week 1. So people are like, oh, he's the GPP play. Just look at DJ Moore and ask yourself, like, okay, what is the route for this player to get to 25 plus points? His projection is really hard because he's historically been a player that's had these massive boom weeks. And then in Carolina, it was like, where is he? So you can kind of play around with that. The optimizer is not going to give you all of that information, but historically speaking, like, you can look at a player like him, look at a player like a Dunze. If he's going to be popular, I don't know. I haven't looked at those things. Like, if he's going to be popular, add in DJ Moore and just double stack and see if you want to go from there.
I love the very simple act of paying up to be contrarian, right?
Yes.
If we see that the Bears receivers as week 1, gets closer, that they're basically, the ownership is in the opposite order of their salary. Well, that's going to be an easy way to change up our lineups. That's a great example outside of a single game theory, but that's such a simple pivot to change your lineups. And yes, you'll have to make salary-based concessions, but you got the DFS pass. You're going to be able to know who those value plays and those low price gems are anyway.
Yeah, it's a fun game week 1. Titans at Bears. Bears are 4-point favorites. It's only a 43 over under, but man, what a volatile game environment with Will Levis, Caleb Williams. Like, those two players, like, under pressure are hilarious because they're willing to play like hero ball. And so that's really good. and really bad. Both of those things. So
Yeah.
next question is from S. Rector, also from Discord. Did you mess around with Sims last year? If so, what were your thoughts on them, and how do you think the adoption of them will change the way we need to play? I'm going to defer to you because I can say confidently, no, I did not mess around with Sims. Sounds like I was just like cheating on my wife or something. But this is more your lane and your expertise, so I'm just going to defer to you.
I did mess around with the Sims.
Was messing around.
Run around Sims. It's a big innovation to have tools like this available to the public. In short, don't worry. In my opinion, simulations have not drastically altered like the typical user's odds at cashing or winning in any given tournament. We should define who a typical user is, I guess. Like, you're not spending more than, like, say 200 or 250 a slate. You may be spending way less than that too. Typically not maxing out or ensuring that you're maxing out large field tournaments, or very rarely doing that. You might take some weeks off. In short, you're playing to engage with the slate in a meaningful way. Maybe there isn't as much of an expectation of consistent profitability. Now, of course, we're going to try to lead you towards consistent profitability with the tools and picks that we have. But in my opinion, simulations are really, really helpful for understanding where the plus EV lineups look like for your projection set. They are very helpful for people multi-entering contests at large volume, because it helps you understand range of outcomes for players on a very, very on a much easier to understand and comprehend scale. You are able to see the randomness and the volatility of DFS at a slightly different level. That does not mean you can see the matrix. It just means that we can see if we can play out 500, 1,000, 500,000 times of a player's sample size based on, again, going back to Solazilla's question, based on historical inputs. And of course, using projections to kind of nudge those simulations towards what we know here and now. It still can't pick up on macro nuances in the game of football, like things like the too high defenses coming into play. That's going to cause model drift for all of these simulation-based tools. And remember, no matter how many simulations it does, 500,000, we still only see one on the field. So if you're only entering one lineup or three lineups or five lineups, you only get to play out a certain amount of those range of outcomes. So again, Don't worry and just intelligently build the crop of lineups that you're focused on. And if you want to get into the large field entering because you've had some success, awesome. These tools are available for you, and we'll definitely help you along the way there. But it's just expressing range of outcomes in a more comprehensible way.
Yeah, and I think with people with the bankroll to be able to take advantage of it, I think a lot of people see the math, they see all the possibilities, and like, oh, this is great, but it really does take one. If it's 14,605 scenarios, only one of those is going to work. And that's okay for Marvel fans out there.
See what you did there.
Yeah. No, I was trying
There's
there.
one end game.
All right. Next one from another Discord user who, I'm just going to say it, Discord name, Harry Ballman Jones. It's great stuff. Would love to learn more about your process for selecting DFS contests. Any particular metrics or entry pools that you find yourself targeting, and how does it change depending on the format? I will say, this is one of our upcoming shows that Betts and I will say, okay, we also send out in the Discord, I think this is helpful. Here are some of the contests that we regularly think you should be entering at different points. It's hard to tell people, here's the best contest, when it's like, I don't know your situation, I don't know your bankroll, and I don't want to know that. You kind of have to figure out what's best for you. There's also some great resources out there that says like, hey, let's say your budget is $100 a week or $50 a week, whatever. Here are the contests that you could break it up. Now, we've been successful trying to get people to manage their bankroll over time by saying cash is a grind. It's tough. I get it. But we think you can be profitable, and we think the process helps you for GPP identify a lot of things. So we're going to have more of that stuff up there. But what's one tip you would give, Matt, on contest selection?
Fully agree on that cash game comment as well. I would say, just to go back to, the primary takeaway that we talked about at the top, contest selection is almost everything. And there are some, for the spreadsheet nerds, we can get into some metrics that you can look at. You can check for flat payout structure, like the percentage of the total payouts that are given
TJ was so good at that. He used to always tweet that out.
And he did it by hand, man. And
what?
The dude grinds for sure. But you can get into those metrics and I actually think there are some like extensions, don't quote me on this, like browser extensions that can help you as you're browsing through contests, see what percentage goes to the top players. You typically want to find payout structures where you don't have to get exactly first place to get a ton of cash. But at the same time, I don't want to discourage people who are just, as I said before, engaging from the slate, hoping for that lottery win type of moment. You can still play in the largest field contest, but again, you need to understand the level of contrarianism needed. And also, we don't have to go full stat nerd here, but playing the correlation game is actually, in my opinion, more fun in single game contests. We get to lean into one of the biggest correlations that we don't get to in main slate, which is a quarterback and their opposing quarterback having very high positive correlation. When Patrick Mahomes is balling out, Lamar Jackson is more likely to ball out as well, and vice versa. And we know that we can lean into the quarterback wide receiver correlations. We know that. How about running back and tight end correlations that tend to get looked over because they're not needed on a positional basis? It really becomes a situation where once I lock in that one contrarian play or that captain I know I need, I can literally just play the correlation game and take 2 or 3 options on top of that to create my main field for my 3 to 5 lineup entries. And then if I want to pivot for something like the largest field tournaments, you're trying to win the 500K, or maybe they got $1 million up top for that week, you're going to have to be as weird as you possibly ever have. I always tell this anecdote because it was weird times. It was 2020. We were doing one of those Zoom holiday parties. I'm sure you were all part of those. So we're sitting there awkwardly, sipping our private cocktails or whatever. And we're watching a showdown slate. And this was when Marcus Mariota was the backup for Derek Carr. And we all had entered lineups in a contest, and we were all playing, the big contest as well. And we see Derek Carr get injured. And there are 2 lineups in the largest field contest that have Marcus Mariota at quarterback. Do I recommend 30, doing this? Say again?
Didn't he go for like 30?
He just torched. He just absolutely went nuts. The Mariota lineup was the nuts. And we laughed about it. But that is the type of crazy that you see in these lineups. And I will say this, there are some sharps, again, who are in, they're maybe in a different financial or DFS state than you might be. They are literally optimizing their pool of lineups for uniqueness, not for scoring, for uniqueness. And they'll check after the lineups lock. They'll see what percentage of my lineups were not duplicated at all. Again, they're not even thinking about scoring in those optimizations. They're thinking about being as unique as possible. Now, you also have to be comfortable, like with a lot of those lineups hitting like the literal 1% of scoring, but. Right. It also shows how contrarian people are willing to be, and you must be, in order to take down those contests. So again, contest selection is everything.
Yeah, and I think for Showdown specifically, I there's so many combinations when I get to a main slate that my brain hurts. People ask me, my least favorite question people ask me is, should I play this player or this player? And I'm always like, that's the wrong question. Like you could convince me of anybody in a main slate. And then you definitely should convince yourself in a 1-game sample size of what could work and what scenario and all those things. I'm looking right now, in general, we look at people that are going to max enter the Millie Maker and go, okay, well, they're pretty serious about this. Week 1, I'm not going to tell anyone, don't play the $5 lottery entry, do it. Now, realize that just to double your entry, okay, so you have to be in the top 22% of the field. So in general, it's not maybe the best contest if you're just thinking like, is this great? But it's week 1. It's $5. It's fun. 951,000 people, go for it. But don't go overboard. And also, there's going to be way too much groupthink in week 1 of what you think is going to happen what everyone's telling you is the best plays, what we think these offenses will look like, that we're just, so that's why I go back and forth. I like I like people being able to throw in $5. I temper because there's so many things we just don't know. There's just so much information yet. And that's hard for me looking at the data and going like, oh gosh. So I can take advantage of that. But I hate telling people that as advice. Like, oh, just go for it. It's like, no, you're going to lose all your money.
And remember, DFS would be no fun if there were not things that were unknown. Sorry for the double negative there. But like the unknowns make this a difficult game. And the difficult game is why it's hard to win. So, of course, being in the industry, you get pressured for takes sometime, like who's the best play.
Right.
And we can give you where the numbers lead you to, and we can say like definitively, this is a different tier of play than, player X, Y, or Z. But if we knew the right answer, then everyone would just play the right plays and no one would win any money. So this variance, this randomness, this uncertainty is something we want. It's a feature, not a bug.
All right, let's get in one more quick question here before our break. This one's from Z Tregs on Twitter. Does the edge on casual bettors in DFS fluctuate throughout the season? Is there an optimal time to play if you aren't planning on playing all 17 weeks? And that is part of our advice that we give is like, it's okay to not play every single week. It's okay to give yourself a break. I always tell people I go on vacation week 5 every year. I think I've done it 5 years in a row. And it's great for me to check out. It's great for me during Thanksgiving. I'm going to play this slate. I'm not going to play every single slate. So would you say that it fluctuates throughout the year? And how do you think about it from the field's perspective?
Actually, I think there is a big difference. I would, obviously have fun, but I actually would try to avoid the early weeks if you're feeling like you want to, find your biggest edge during the season, because I do think that there is a push from a lot, from a marketing standpoint, that makes sense to bring, casual bettors and casual DFS players back into the market. That obviously makes sense from a business perspective, but just think about who is putting a ton of money down and how they might have to deviate their attention at certain times of the year. And what I'm really speaking about is in mid to late October, when all the fall sports start to come back and basketball's starting to get in full swing and hockey's back, and the DFS sharps and the betting sharps, they have to focus on all those areas. You can kind of swoop in with your knowledge of football in general. So come in with your ability to know ball at that point, usually around week 8 to 10 in the season. And your goal is to focus on the macro, especially if you're a football first or a watch the games first kind of guy. Think about coaching tendencies, some of the larger trends you've picked up that projections might not pick up. This is where I totally get off the spreadsheet, get off the code, because these are areas where the betting sharps are using every tool and simulation, technology that they've got in the book. They need to rely on that to speed up their process, where you can slow down. What does this coach like to do in this situation? How is that going to affect the QB scrambling? We were talking about a quarterback versus the blitz before we got on the show, and how if we knew as a defense that they were going to blitz them a lot, how that might affect a quarterback's projections. That's the type of thing you can implement in your 3 to 5 lineups, or if you're betting, in your prop choices in your betting card, that you just can spend more time on in those mid weeks. And then sort of as the playoffs roll around, there's another big marketing push. But yeah, try the middle of the season if that's your goal.
Yeah, I would say another piece of advice is try not to make overarching general statements of this is what this group of people. When we talk about people that are casual, I think it's really hard to just figure out, like, one, how many people is that? What is that? What do we consider someone a casual? Because really, I would just say, like, it's somebody who's throwing in a couple bucks and maybe they're not thinking optimally about how to create a lineup. I don't know how many people there are. I don't know how many of those people in your contest. You might be one of those people. So I think it's just not helpful to say this part of the year there's casual people. Yes, at the beginning of the year, there will be more people throwing in money. And then, yes, there are people that don't have the bankroll to finish the year. I get that. You could also say that the people sticking around are people that are really, really serious about it. But it's really hard to just get an entire group of people that you don't know and say this is what they're like at different points of the year. So I think that if you have a process, you stay consistent, you can have fun. But yeah, I do find the same thing with playoffs. Like there's this renewed optimism of like, all right, well now I'm back in because there's only a couple of games and I want to focus on these games. It's a little different. Like I think it's a different game of DFS than grinding out that week 17, week 18, where you're like, the chalk play is this third string running back this week.
Well, you know what? I've actually, my feelings have changed having gone so far into the weeds with single game slates over the last, 18 months. It's almost like it's a 3-phase season. So you have the hopeful phase, the early season where teams are not sure of their identity. So you see players that typically would get a ton of looks. Sometimes they won't get the opportunity that we expect. So there's fluctuation because teams are learning their own identities. Then there's the midseason where everyone's essentially like trying their best. But essentially the minute we hit Thanksgiving, we see this grand divergence of teams who are headed towards the playoffs, starting to lean on their studs, and other teams who are kind of heading in a different direction. And you'll see this, especially in these ugly, like Thursday single game slates where like third string running backs we didn't expect are getting in the game in the third quarter because it's a blowout and the team's already headed for their 9th loss in the middle of November. And the coaching staff legitimately just wants to see this running back get run. And so once we get back into the playoffs, it is a different game because all the studs are getting leaned on once again. And there's none of these like throwaway.
Yes.
I wouldn't call it a throwaway slate because the game theory aspects are still really fun, but everyone's kind of leaning on the same thing. We want to win.
Yeah, you could see that last year where Carolina was like, all right, we're trying to figure this out. Adam Thielen, at least he knows where to be on the field. Let's just pepper him with targets. And then at the end of the year, it was clear like, okay, this isn't working. We have a different coaching staff. Everyone's going to leave here. Cowboys did the exact opposite. They're like, okay, man, this is not working inside the red zone. Like, it's just not. Why don't we get our best player and just feed him the rock? Like, just throw him the ball as much as possible. And then you saw the success that they had leaning on the studs and poor Tony Pollard. I started going back and looking at some of those carries because, it's like the inside the 5 carries, he converted 3 of them. Some of them were just bad luck. I really felt bad. The one that, he should have gotten in and everyone used a meme for it, but it's like, poor guy. Just there's a little bit of variance where I go, he got tackled at the 1, or man, he got tripped up, or man, this O lineman was out of place. So that's just really hard. I don't think he stinks.
Yeah, no. And he even said that, just use the Pollard example, like he was dealing with injury and he didn't feel like himself. I think he said week 11 is when he finally started feeling like himself. So I am interested to see what he looks like, but that's a great example because Dallas understood its identity. And now it didn't work. It didn't work in the playoffs because they completely folded.
Because it never does.
But I got to give credit to McCarthy, who just said, this isn't working. We know it does. We're just going to do it until it doesn't. And and to Dak and CD's credit, it worked pretty darn well.
All right, let's take one more break and we'll come right back.
The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is,
"Thank you for calling. Please listen to your list of 46 possible service options."
Which is why when you choose USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable. 24/7 online service for claims, access to roadside assistance, and more. All at the touch of a button. Start getting the service you deserve. Get a quote today. Ability to receive a quote depends on membership eligibility. Membership eligibility and product restrictions apply and are subject to change. USAA means United Services Automobile Association and its affiliates, San Antonio, Texas.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
All right, we're going to change gears. I know that some of you guys had some best ball questions and some betting ones, so we're going to kind of finish through there. This one's from Nick DeLuca on Twitter. He asked, you recently mentioned about grabbing 2 running backs from the same team in best ball. It's a strategy that could work, like the Chargers, or last year it was obviously awesome if you took the Dolphins. What do you think about a cheap 3 quarterback build with a solid QB1 of teammates like Darnold and McCarthy? My first thought is you're really trying to thread the needle that this is going to work. One that like let's say McCarthy does take over and he's good. That's the best case scenario here for this team. Like you need Darnold to be a really key piece to this construction to work. I mean, the narrative is McCarthy's in after they get their bye and you get like 5 or 6 weeks of Darnold. I just think there's like, you don't have to do this. There's 3 quarterbacks you can build with. And, you know, if you do want to have a Minnesota stack, like to me, I get a stud and then you can kind of build late. If you want to get like 2 cheapies, get like a, you know, Derek Carr, Bryce Young, or Will Levis, and then McCarthy and just say, I'm swinging the fences. Fine. I just think it's a waste of draft capital. And I just don't think it's going to work.
It's different at the quarterback position than it is at the running back position because you only start one in typical best ball leagues. And so the thread, the needle that you're talking about is it's really hard. You're basically saying Darnold is the one you needed early. McCarthy is the one you needed late. I would actually prefer to do this with 2 different teams. So like a Darnold and Drake May situation where like, okay, Darnold comes in, does what he did on the Panthers, has a bunch of rushing touchdowns, then gets benched after losing a bunch of games, and then Drake May comes on later, something like that. That's totally hypothetical, but using the same team, you're essentially saying, I know they're both great, and I know one's going to get injured, essentially.
Yeah, it's with running backs, it's a different conversation because we've seen them ping pong. Like we saw that with Achane, we saw that with Mostert last year where they had weeks together, but you kind of get that ping pong approach. You also saw it with like Zach Moss and JT where it's like, okay, we saw the ebb and flow of like when JTT was out. And so I just think with quarterback, you just don't need to do it.
It's also the legendary upside of you could have like Alvin Kamara, Mark Ingram, 2017, where they're both top 12 running backs. Like that definitely doesn't exist at the quarterback position.
No, that's a good point. Next one from Alex. How early is too early to start counting my winnings from a few July drafts that started Lamb, Debo, Waddle, thanks to you and Betts for all the work and rankings. I looked up current ADP. I mean, that's fun. That's a fun start, especially if Ayuk moves on. Lamb, you're taking the very beginning, and then Debo, Waddle. Like we've been ahead on Waddle the whole time. I like that. Congrats, but also, I mean, this is best ball. Come on.
If you're doing it, I mean, you're doing X/Twitter right, Alex, because you're victory lapping now, and that's what you do in August. But if you're still drafting best ball teams and the ADP is different, do not worry that, you know, someone got this player at such and such Alex. ADP.
Like Alex here. Now, yeah, I think that is a fear of looking at rosters. And what's so great about, you know, we play mostly on Underdog is that you can time box certain contests and go, okay. And one of the best things you can do is label them and say, okay, this was early June. Or I'm playing in one where you could basically max in, or I think it was like 7, 8 lineups. And it's like, okay, I know that this is just for this. So I don't have to worry about what value did I not get in May for this certain contest. So if you're in those smaller field ones that basically are, 4 to 8 max, then you can kind of time box them and not feel so bad that you missed out on certain values. That is the fear though in best ball, is I'm missing out on this awesome value. Guys, there's so much chaos. There's so many first round players.
Embrace the FOMO. Embrace it.
Yeah. Okay, this is a good one. And I'm glad this one is here for you. It's from Rajan. I believe I'm pronouncing that correct. One of the best ball community's themes this year is scroll the F down. How do you guys find a balance between scrolling for a low owned player? So you're at the end of your draft, around 17, 18, you're just scrolling down and you're saying, hey, Will Shipley used to be this guy. Now Will Shipley is kind of moved up into being, 208 or whatever. Mm-hmm. So how do you find the balance between scrolling all the way down and not having dead roster spots? So this has been this is a good opportunity for you.
This is an area where I have focused, I would say, way too much. Let me crack the old knuckles here. That's a great question, Rajan. This has become something I've obsessed about over the last 2 seasons, and I have found the strategy for rounds like 16 to 18 or whatever the final 3 or so rounds of best ball drafts to be irrationally fun, because the game theory is really difficult. There are a lot of things to think about, right? Positionally, you're usually undermanned at a position that needs to be addressed. Structurally, you have picks and correlated plays from earlier in the draft that you want to pile on to, add to those correlation plays. And then personally, you have players that you just simply like that are still available on the board. And now there's even the added effect where people have their rostership and ownership projections for best ball tournaments where you're literally thinking, I want a player who most of the field does not have. I would say this. If you're really, really running out of time and that clock is running down to the final seconds, if you're not sure who the pick should be, just go with a QB3. Because consistently 40 to 45 quarterbacks per season score in that positional top 12 at least once. And so if, that 18th round pick is going to be useless anyway, or their expected usable weeks, if you will, are closer to zero than anything else, imagine just one top 12 quarterback 1 week from that position and how much that can aid you. So again, lots to think about. But when I think of that motto, I'm really thinking about scroll the F down is that motto. I think about the mid rounds and really like mid tier more than anything else. So, just to use a hypothetical, wide receivers at the end of round 1 and the beginning of round 3, if you look at historical simulations, perform on average similarly. Not the exact same in terms of usable and spike weeks. I'm not going to say that they're the exact same, but if you wanted to take a player who's going at the end of the second, beginning of the third, at the end of the first round, you are not somehow cratering the value of your best ball team, especially when you can add structural components that make this a strong play anyway, like adding in correlations. So, if you believe in the 49ers and you don't feel like Deebo Samuel is going to be there at the 112, go for it. But get Kittle, get Lions players for that week 17 correlation, make it structurally sound. And then, when you hit other tiers, just, focus on other aspects. I will also admit that I am a card carrying member of the Scroll the F Down community. I actually created a site called scroll the letter F down.life. And, I'm still working out the kinks, working out the bugs, but it's basically using individual simulations. You can upload underdog rankings and create simulations for you that actually shows you the deviations, the variations, and the range of outcomes for these players. So, still a work in progress, gonna continue to work on it over the course of the year for things like BBM6. But I think this is a really, really fun question, and I'm glad you asked it, Rajan.
Is there any quarterbacks, you mentioned quarterbacks, that you like? I know, so looking at guys that are going late, past QB 30, so Bo Nix QB 30, JJ McCarthy, Russell Wilson, Sam Darnold, Gardner Minshew, and then you get to like Taysom, Aiden O'Connell, Michael Penix. What guys would you lean towards?
Anybody who can rush in general, I'm gonna pick. So obviously when Fields was down there, it was fun.
So Trey Lance, got it.
But you joke, we've already seen, I don't want to put it out there because I have plenty of Dak Prescott in my portfolio, but stranger things have happened on a football field. I do like Bryce Young. He's kind of sitting there late rounds, QB 27. I know that, there is a tier cutoff for players who people think will get benched. Daniel Jones often is sitting there at the end because they think he's going to get benched.
Yes.
I think a full season of Daniel Jones is very much in the range of outcomes. And then, of course, with quarterback evaluation being so hard, who says Drake May can't be a good quarterback? I'm certainly not. I'm certainly
not
one of
leaving
that out. Yeah.
Bigger stances that I loved him as a prospect. So on Dynasty Show, talked him up. Best ball, I've had some questions. Justin Fields has been one of those players that's funny because he dropped to outside of like the top, 210. And now his ADP is at 180 that people are like, wait a second. Mm-hmm. We don't know everything. We know his upside as a QB3. I mean, that is a fun player to be able to throw in there. I mean, he came out today, Tomlin did, so like, okay, like Russ is starting, but there's some fun players. Sam Howell's a fun player. It was a fun player last year that I was really, really big on just for rushing upside, even though might be one of the grosser quarterbacks out there in general. But yeah, I'm glad you got to be on this. And so say the website one more time for people if they want to mess around.
Yeah, the website is scroll the F down. The letter F is there, so scroll the F down. .life. I live to scroll the F down. .life.
All right, let's go one more here. This is a passing yardage props one, and I thought this was interesting. Maybe a bigger point here. From DK Onyx says FanDuel has Jared Goff's passing yardage set at 4,025.5 on DraftKings. It's 4,050, but he went over the last 2 years. He only has 3 games outside. This seems like a smash play. And then he followed it up with saying, which is in play, St. Brown or Laporta's touchdowns? They're both at 7.5. Hammer both. Let me just first say, Betts and I rarely give overs on season-long stuff. I mean, just like, it just doesn't happen. Because historically, you're kind of looking at the season with optimism in general already. When you're drafting your team for your home leagues, I mean, I have an auction draft that's coming up when this recording's out. Like, I am so excited. It's one of my favorite leagues. I'm brimming with optimism. If you look at season-long stuff, it should be the exact opposite. You should think that this is a graveyard for players. And last year, if you want to just look at last year's data set, it was terrible for quarterbacks. Like, if you just took the under for every single quarterback last year and just their passing yardage prop, it was a 64% hit rate. Okay. And I did do that. I did do that because I just know that historically speaking, we have all these things that think is going to go right. Now, last year were hit with a ton of injuries, right? Like way more than maybe we're used to. But if you took blindly the unders, it hit last year, including a couple that you go, wait a second, like Josh Allen, who killed it last year, fantasy's number 1, like was under his by 44.5 yards. You just didn't even realize it. Patrick Mahomes, like, oh, he can totally hit this 5,000 yards. He was under by over 617 yards. So in general, I'm a person that is very much more pessimistic on season-long stuff. And maybe that's something that you need to kind of add into your analysis.
Well said. And, just historical rates on unders like that for passing yards, kind of tells you that's the base rate we need to lean on. Certainly seemed to work last year. But when I look at a prop like that or a set of props like that, DK Onyx, the first thing I ask myself is, okay, wait, how many games does Goff actually need to play in order to go over that number? And my quick back of the napkin math says that he needs to play 16 games, which in the NFL, unfortunately, that's anything but guaranteed. But, since you asked, let's break this down the way that I would do it with just some quick math calculations. And maybe this can help your process. And, if not, throw it away. Goff in 2023, he was at 268 pass yards a game, 35 attempts. That's 7.6 yards per attempt. 2022, 261 yards a game at 34.5 attempts per game. That's, again, 7.6 yards per attempt. That's actually good. It looks like there's some stickiness there. So your prop line, 4,025.5 divided by that 7.6. Oh, the math is so fun. We're looking at 529 to 530 expected passes. If you look at Goff and the Lions pass rate over the last few years, which again, isn't the stickiest number year to year, that's 15.5 games he's got to play. So in that 16th game, he might get over that number. Not to mention all the variance in yards per attempt that we see over the course of the year. What if they win a lot and Gibbs and Monty are just good and that's their identity? What if they tank and the attempts go up, but the yards per attempt plummets? At 6 yards per attempt instead of 7.6, he'd need 6 to 7 attempts more per game to make up for that lack of efficiency. Just showing you the range here, even if the Lions do what we kind of expect them to do. So it's really asking you, how many games do all those players play together? Do you think they have a full bill of health? Go for it, man.
Yeah, and I would just say it's just easier for me to bet against that. I'll be wrong. You'll be wrong on certain players. Like, can Jared Goff hit over 4,000 yards? Yeah, of course. Like, yes, this offense. What if they're so good that he's, one, not playing week 18 or part of week 17? Or what if they blow people out and he's playing, 2.5, 3 quarters? There's just so many other variables. And we didn't even mention him getting hurt. We just didn't even say that yet, which, there's so many players that happens. So in general, we're going to take the unders. We're not going to give out passing overs at all. Even rushing yardage ones, man, like all the time people will send me ones. I'm like, oh, that's so tempting. I get it. I see it. We're probably just going to end up staying away and then taking the unders on ones that we feel more confident in. So it's still an area that I feel like Betts and I don't give out as many props as people want us to. I don't know. That's just the way that's going to always work, though.
Well, good bets are better than many bets, I would say.
Yeah. But make sure you get all those bets. Just put out one that he was funny. He did an alert for the Discord channel. He said, now Kyle doesn't agree with me. And so people understand, like, okay, we're not always just saying the same things to each other. We kind of go back and forth and make sure we look at the projections and everything else. But get all those. UltimateDraftKit.com, our DFS pass. I mean, our week 1 player props will be out in just a second. So should be good. Matt, thank you for getting to come on this podcast. I appreciate your level of like you said, you got to obsess over some of this stuff over the last year plus.
It really was a blast to be here. And yeah, we got to get into the weeds of what I've been looking at the last few years. So yeah, this was so much fun. Hopefully I can come back sometime, meet up with you and Bets. Best of luck to him making it through his paternity leave. And yeah, I'm sure we'll be back very soon.
Yep. So you can expect more for us soon. Bets will be back. And next week we'll be back talking more DFS, talking more strategy. We'll talk to you then. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to another edition of the Fantasy Footballers DFS and Betting Podcast. Don't forget to visit us on the web at thefantasyfootballers.com.